this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, dear delegates, welcome to this online event organized by the United Nations Environment Programme, and more particularly its Chemicals and Waste Branch, in collaboration with the Geneva Environment Network. You have joined us today to be introduced to the UNEP Issues of Concern report entitled Chemicals and Waste Issues of Concern, a summary analysis of stakeholders' views and priorities for further work and potential further international action. The leading experts who have joined us on the panel today will bring their perspectives on the findings of the report, exchange on the role of agreements and instruments, as well as on the way forward. This process and the report are a follow-up of resolutions adopted at the United Nations Environment Assembly, the world's highest level decision-making body on the environment. The event you are attending today complements indeed a series of events that UNEP has organized in the past years. And I'm stuck here, sorry, including the two that have been hosted by the Geneva Environment Network. We will kick off this event with a formal welcome by the United Nations Environment Programme, co-convening this event, and by Switzerland, motor of the important resolutions on the sound management of chemicals and waste adopted by the United Nations Environmental Assembly. After the opening segment, John Roberts, an independent consultant with an extensive experience on the regulation of chemicals that many of you know, will be moderating this event and guide you throughout this session. And also to be mentioned that John has worked on the report that is going to be presented. Before you are formally welcomed, let me remind all our attendees that the documents, the video, and the summary will be made available as usual on our website, and you can find the link on the screen on the various slides, but also it has been shared in the chat. Throughout the event, you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box, and there are slides here explaining how you can access that box. And we have dedicated sessions to answer these. And I also want to add that the transcript is also available in over 100 languages, as you can see on the slide. It's my pleasure now to turn to Mr. Ludovic Bernodat, the head of the Knowledge and Risk Unit in the UNEP Chemicals and Health Branch, to welcome you and introduce you to our session today. With that, Mr. Bernodat, you have the floor.
Thank you, Diana. And I would like to welcome the distinguished panelists for this event today, and also the attendees that have joined us to discuss and participate in this for the next 2 hours. I would like to remind, of course, that this work was undertaken as a response to UNEA 5 Resolution 7, which requested the Executive Director of UNEP to seek view from member states and other stakeholders on the priorities for further work, building on existing measures and initiatives on potential further international action on the 19 issues of concern discussed in the previous report that was issued on assessment report and issues of concerns. And that work was undertaken by our unit with the support of a number of people and member states and the participation of all the stakeholders. We held, you will remember, a face-to-face event in July 2023 in the Palais here in Geneva. And then we followed up with a call for written inputs and global consultation, for which we received close to 200 participations. So really a big thank you for that. The report summarizing the views that we have collected was presented an advanced unedited version to UNEA 6. And UNEA 6 welcomed this report and the resolution 9. The report is now launched, and today we're here to mark this milestone. And you can see in the body of the report and in the annex the summary of each of the views received for each of the issues of concerns. So before I hand over the floor back, I would like to thank a number of people and institutions. First of all, I would like to thank the government of Switzerland for the financial support for this work. I would like to thank the Geneva Environmental Network for their collaboration in organizing this event and the close collaboration throughout the process. Of course, I'd like to thank the governments, international organizations, civil society, private sector and academia who have contributed their time and inputs to the consultation process, both in the face-to-face event, but then again answering the survey that we launched. And finally, I would like to thank the authors of the report, Jessica Templeton and John Roberts, who we'll hear from today, for their work in developing this very comprehensive and thorough analysis of views expressed. So I'm looking forward to a rich discussion today around the key findings from this work. And I'm looking forward, including in the light of the new and upcoming global instruments, for further work with you all on these issues. Thank you very much, and back to you, Diana.
Thank you very much, Ludovic. So now we move on to deliver opening remarks. We are now turning to Océane Dayer, who is representing Switzerland as their waste and chemicals focal point. Ms. Dayer, over to you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I would like first to thank UNEP and the GEN for organizing this important event. In 2020, in response to UNEA Resolution 48, UNEP published an assessment report on issues of concern, which provided a comprehensive overview of 19 chemicals and waste issues of concern and the risk they pose to human health and the environment. The report's conclusion was clear. International action by all stakeholders is urgently needed. Building on these, later on, UNEP 5 adopted Resolution 7, originally tabled by Switzerland, Thailand, and Peru, recognizing the need for more targeted efforts. This resolution tasked UNEP with conducting a global consultation, as we've heard from Ludovic before, to gather views from member states and stakeholders on priorities to future work and potential international actions. Switzerland has been very supportive of this global consultation, and I am pleased to represent the government of Switzerland here today, where the outcome of this process is presented. While I now will not go into the details of the summary analysis, which will be presented shortly by the authors, I'd like to highlight three elements that we find particularly important. First, to facilitate action, we have to make best use of existing international governance instruments while further developing and complementing them where necessary. In this way, we can succeed in this balancing act of acting swiftly yet effectively. Several stakeholders pointed to instruments like the Global Framework on Chemicals, the binding agreement on plastic pollution that is right now under negotiation, and the Minamata Convention as key mechanisms that need to be strengthened. Second, the summary analysis highlights the benefits of clustering issues of concern. Rather than addressing chemicals one by one, grouping approaches can enable faster, more comprehensive responses. Third, the summary analysis emphasizes that different approaches may be needed depending on the issue of concern. For cadmium, lead, and the group of metals and metalloids in general, legally binding instruments could be effective. For others, more information, guidelines, and political leadership will be needed. Articulating these different elements to meet everyone's needs and leave no one behind will be very crucial. Finally, the insights from this analysis offer an opportunity to explore how existing measures and initiatives can be strengthened and highlight areas where further international coordination is essential to reduce risk associated with issues of concern. So let's seize this opportunity to ensure global chemicals and waste governance is strengthened and ready to face actual and future challenges. Thank you very much to UNEP for conducting this consultation and drafting the summary analysis, and to all stakeholders for your continued engagement. I look forward to today's discussions and the insight that will help us move towards stronger, more effective global action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ocean, for those remarks, and thank you again to Switzerland for your support for this work. We're now going to have a presentation which takes us through the main findings in the report. As Dan said, I was one of the people who worked on this report with UNEP, but the person who did the main work, the hard work, was my colleague Jessica Templeman, who's now going to give us a presentation. Jessica works for IISD and for Earth Negotiation Bulletin, and she's based in Minnesota in the USA. So good morning to you, Jessica. Can I just remind you that there is a chat function and a Q&A function, so do register your questions even while Jessica is speaking, and then in the panel sessions and in the Q&A sessions, I can put some of those questions to the panelists and also to Jessica. So Jessica, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, John. It was my pleasure to work closely with John and with colleagues from UNEP to prepare this report. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to give you a very high-level overview of the insights that we gathered during the consultation. And I think my slides, yes, if you could go to the next one, please. This is just the overview of the background, the rationale for this project. As Ludovic and Ocean explained, this consultation aimed to gather input from stakeholders around the world on priorities for further international action on 19 issues of concern. Next, please. The report represents contributions of stakeholders from governments, intergovernmental organizations, civil society, the private sector, and academia. This slide gives you a sense of the consultation process. I won't go into detail, but as you can see, there were multiple opportunities for stakeholder engagement between April and August 2023. And you can find a detailed explanation of the process and information about contributors in the report. As you might expect, the inputs we received were very rich and varied, and we have carefully reflected the different perspectives that were shared by stakeholders, both in the main report and in its annex. Next. So the assessment report addressed 8 issues that are emerging policy issues or other issues of concern identified under SICEM, and 11 issues for which emerging evidence of risks was identified by the second Global Chemicals Outlook. During the consultation process, we organized these issues into groups based on their similarities. And these groups were intended to facilitate consideration in this particular process, in the consultation, and the issues could be organized differently. So in the next few slides, I'm going to highlight some of the key concerns that stakeholders shared, as well as some of the possible responses that they proposed. Again, all of this is spelled out in detail in the report, and I would encourage you to refer both to the report and its annex for more information about stakeholders' priorities and preferences. But for now, here are some of the key insights that were shared. In the category of metals and metalloids, stakeholders emphasized the significant negative impacts of arsenic, cadmium, lead, and organotins on human health and the environment. They also highlighted the need for improved transparency around uses and releases. While many called for urgent international action on all of the metals and metalloids in this group, some prioritized lead and cadmium. Many called for establishing a legally binding instrument like the Minamata Convention on Mercury. And some felt that such an instrument could address all of the metals and metalloids, but others felt that a new treaty could be dynamic. It could cover just 1 or 2 metals initially, and then include provisions to add others in the future. Oh, sorry, I'm not quite done. Sorry. Thank you. Some stakeholders wanted to avoid setting up another instrument for international action for a single chemical and said dealing with these as a group would help to engage more partners. Additionally, some contributors supported setting up global partnerships that would be similar to the Global Mercury Partnership and said this could facilitate action during the time it would take to establish a legally binding instrument. Okay, next. Thank you. On pesticides, a majority of stakeholders supported international action on the pesticides in this group, and they cited the negative impacts on human health and the environment. However, some stakeholders said evidence of harm from these pesticides is less clear or disputed. Many stakeholders from a variety of backgrounds called for improving labeling requirements for pesticides and other bioactive substances. Several highlighted the problems associated with poor or non-existent labeling of pesticides in some countries, which poses a risk to farm workers in particular, who often lack both the personal protective equipment and information about intended usage and risks. Several pointed to the importance of these pesticides to food production and said transitioning away from widely available and affordable chemicals could be economically disruptive. Some said that substitutes must be at least as affordable and accessible as the chemicals they are meant to replace. Next. A majority of stakeholders said that environmentally persistent pharmaceutical pollutants are high or very high priorities for action. Several said that lack of visibility of this problem is a key obstacle, and many called for voluntary initiatives such as information sharing and awareness-raising campaigns. Some also supported creating a legally binding instrument or using soft law to address this challenge. Respondents indicated that a life cycle approach is essential, and many highlighted the need to develop and enforce standards for safe design, approval, production, prescription, take-back, and disposal. Next. So this large group of chemicals and products includes issues of concern, classes of chemicals, and individual substances that pose risks to consumers. Many respondents highlighted overlaps in these categories. For example, PFAS, BPA, and phthalates could be addressed as part of action on endocrine disrupting chemicals. Many respondents said that the main challenges associated with this group relate to the lack of knowledge and transparency about chemicals and products, and they called for better information about which chemicals are contained in which products. Again, many stakeholders pointed to poor or non-existent labeling and highlighted the need for information sharing across the life cycles of chemicals and products. Stakeholders said information sharing and awareness raising could address some of these issues, while for others, it might be feasible to use existing legally binding instruments. Many also highlighted the potential roles of the Global Framework on Chemicals, the Future Science Policy Panel, and the future legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. Next. So what should be done? Stakeholders who contributed to the written part of the consultation identified their priorities for action, saying which issues they considered to be most urgent and which they considered to be most actionable. As you can see, there's some overlap between the two categories, but also some divergence. Stakeholders considered action on HHPs, EDCs, lead, chemicals and products, PFAS, and microplastics to be most urgent. They considered lead, EDCs, PFAS, environmentally persistent pharmaceutical pollutants, H-sleep, and chemicals in products to be most actionable. While member states and other stakeholders prioritized many of the same issues, more than twice the number of non-government stakeholders than member states said that chemicals and products were most urgent. Non-government actors also prioritized triclosan and lead in paint. Next. Stakeholders were also asked to identify the international forums or instruments that they felt were best placed to take the lead on further international action. This slide reflects their choices. However, it is important to note that stakeholders consistently identified a wide range of international forums or instruments that they felt should contribute to action. The report spells this out in detail. It is worth noting, and I'll discuss this again in just a moment, that stakeholders repeatedly called for taking holistic action on these issues, including by breaking down silos across national agendas and encouraging broader cooperation. Next. Relatedly, this consultation revealed some cross-cutting insights that stakeholders felt should inform action across all 19 issues of concern. The majority of stakeholders indicated that international action is needed to address each of the 19 issues. They stressed the harmful impacts of hazardous chemicals and waste on human health and the environment, and the critical links between healthy ecosystems and human well-being. Many stakeholders also emphasized that international action is essential for countries that have limited technical or financial capacity to track chemicals and enforce regulations. And as you can see at the bottom of the slide, stakeholders cited difficulties in resource mobilization as an obstacle to national action for 13 issues. Next. Stakeholders emphasized the disproportionate impacts of hazardous chemicals and chemical pollution on at-risk populations and cited several important principles and approaches that many felt should guide action. These included the polluter pays principle, the precautionary approach, the environmental democracy principle, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, and extended producer responsibility for pollution. They also mentioned the need for intergenerational equity and deeper engagement with youth, and the importance of centering Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge in future work. Next. Stakeholders repeatedly highlighted the importance of improved transparency and access to information throughout the life cycles of chemicals and products. Many emphasized that this will allow informed decisions by policymakers, businesses, and consumers, and is an essential component of adequate regulatory responses. Next, please. Education, awareness raising, and knowledge sharing are critical, as many of the risks posed by chemicals are poorly communicated. For 10 of the 19 issues, stakeholders said difficulties sharing knowledge and coordinating action across sectors were key obstacles to action. Next. Finally, as I mentioned, stakeholders emphasized that solutions need to be holistic. Many stakeholders emphasized that instead of dealing with substances one by one, future work should facilitate faster and broader responses to risks through so-called grouping approaches. They also said it is essential to break down silos among issues, address interconnected agendas, and engage all relevant sectors and actors throughout the life cycles of chemicals and products. Stakeholders identified a range of possible connections with other international agendas, as well as gaps where there is currently no international body with a mandate for action. Next, please. You can find a much more detailed summary and analysis of this consultation in the report. And for a detailed summary of stakeholders' written inputs on each of the 19 issues of concern, please see the annex. Finally, the submissions themselves are also available online. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for that excellent summary of our report that gives the key messages. I just emphasize that it is well worth looking at some of the detailed responses. Some of the stakeholders put in very thoughtful responses. All their views, of course, are very helpful and useful. And thank you to everyone who contributed. But we're now going to have an opportunity to hear from a number of people speaking from different viewpoints in two panel sessions. The first panel is going to ask about perspectives and views from stakeholders about the issues raised in the report and their reaction to the views that stakeholders have given. And our first speaker is going to be Bob Diderich from OECD. Bob, he's based in Paris and he is head of the Environment, Health and Safety Division. And he has a long experience on chemical assessment programs, quantitative methods, and so on. He's also just been elected as the chair of the Interorganizational Program for the Sound Management of Chemicals, which is the body that coordinates as far as possible, the activities of the various UN bodies that are active in this area to give joined up approaches and good coordination. So Bob, we look forward to hearing your views. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So yes, I wanted to react on some of the outcomes of the report, and also some of the lessons learned from the IOMC's work on some of the emerging policy issues under SAICM. One of the things that did not come out of the report, and which is one of the lessons learned from our work on the SAICM emerging policy issues, is that a lot of the issues identified actually hinge on the potential for countries to act. Mainly, many countries do not have the legal framework in place that allow them to propose risk management measures for many of the chemicals that they consider to be of concern. So that means that, for example, talking about nanomaterials, UNITAR and the OECD, we did a lot of awareness raising around the world about the issues, and countries were super engaged. They were super happy to talk about what they're doing on nanomaterials. But at the end of the day, even if some of the nanomaterials would have been identified as causing a risk to human health or the environment, those countries were not in a position to do anything about it because they didn't have the legal framework in place that allowed regulators to take action. The same is true for PFAS, the same is true for endocrine disruptors, and so on. So one of the lessons learned and one of the, I think, of the recommendations we need to keep pushing is that in order for us to be effective, countries do need to put in place basic legal frameworks that allow them to take regulatory actions on chemicals, unless, of course, we solve everything by international conventions, which is maybe not entirely realistic. I wanted also to react on a grouping of chemicals. That is indeed quite interesting. There's a lot of experience in OECD countries, certainly, about grouping for hazard assessment, but that's a purely scientific exercise that allows you to better assess the hazards of more chemicals in a shorter time. When it comes to risk management of groups of chemicals, like, for example, managing the whole group of PFAS, that is where we currently do not have a lot of experience. There's only very few countries around the world. To be honest, it's mainly the European Union and some other countries, Canada, for example, that are trying to go down that route. And some of it is absolutely a no-brainer. For example, I think we should consider about making sure that chemicals which are carcinogens, mutagens, or reprotoxicants are not put into consumer products. That is a group approach, as a risk-based consumer approach, which makes perfect sense, and is something that we could all think about. But currently, this is only done in the European Union. It is not done systematically in other countries. So there is a lot of potential there, a lot of opportunity, but right now there's not a lot of experience. So it's something that would need a lot more, let's say, discussion for the future. I have a couple more minutes, so I'll just raise a couple more issues. How can we prevent that there's going to be new issues of concern? There's always going to be new issues of concern, simply because our knowledge increases, and there's always going to be innovation. One thing that we learned at the OECD is that currently our legal frameworks for regulating chemicals are not set up to talk to innovators. They're not set up to have a dialogue between regulators and innovators, which would be absolutely necessary if we want to catch early new and innovative chemical solutions in the future, which may cause a problem to human health and the environment. So that's clearly one aspect that we will need to work on, how to get innovators and regulators to talk to each other, to identify problems early. What should we do next? I think one thing that we will try to do also under the global framework on chemicals is try to mainstream some of those issues of concern into general chemicals management. But once again, one of the prerequisites for that will be that countries have in place basic chemicals management systems that allow them to do so. And I'll stop here and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob, for those interesting remarks, which I think give us some various ideas to consider, and we'll come back to some of those during the discussion. Thank you. Our next speaker is Melissa Wang. Melissa is an environmental scientist by training. She's working with Greenpeace and heavily involved in a number of negotiations currently, including the Science Policy Panel negotiation and the development of the Plastics Treaty. And she also has an honorary role at the University of Exeter to keep her scientific work going. So, Melissa, we look forward to hearing your views. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for your very kind introduction, and congratulations to Bob. I also would like to take the chance to thank UNEP for providing such an informative report by truly listening to stakeholders and incorporating our views. I would like to echo what Bob has just said. The word holistic has been repeated many times in the report, which could have different levels of interpretation and implication. One level that I would like to echo and emphasize here is the synergistic approach based on the identification and understanding of strong interlinkages between chemicals with other global agenda, like, for example, biodiversity and climate change. Just as the impacts of those multiple challenges are compounded when they are linked, so are the solutions. That's why we need to have a holistic approach to break down silos among issues, among disciplines, and among sectors. In a recent meeting I attended, Sir James Gee, the chair of IPCC, also emphasized this importance of synergistic and holistic approach. And he has already applied this into action through collaboration between IPCC and EBS at the science level. There's potential, for example, for the SPP, once established, up and running, to work with its counterparts in a holistic way, including on issues of concerns being listed here. Another element under the holistic approach is indeed the grouping approach for the research and regulation of chemicals, as emphasized by many. This was something new to me when I first encountered with the chemical management field, something very aspirational and somehow idealistic for me back then. But I'm so impressed by colleagues' collective effort to translate this vision into practice in the last decades, so that we are not only talking about some abstract principles or theories or possibilities, but now we have many solid examples and experiences that could be learned from or expanded on. I think Bob has already raised quite a few of those examples that I'm not going to duplicate on. And I believe there are even more examples and initiatives that I personally might not be aware of yet, that I would encourage colleagues to share both the success and lessons, so that we can collectively to work to advance on this. Currently, under the INC negotiation for the new Global Plastic Treaty, the need for holistic approach and chemical grouping have also been mentioned by many, like from the Scientist Coalition. And I believe they should also be incorporated into, for example, the implementation program of the new global framework of chemicals. And another aspect is about how can we shift from a reactive approach to a more preventative and proactive approach. So put it simply, what we say, to get ahead of the game. This awareness is already a very good step towards the right direction so that we can prevent future silent springs. And I personally think there are at least 2 levels of actions could be taken based on the holistic approach that has just been discussed. The first one is to prevent issues of concern from emerging by designing out them from the system based on all those late lessons and best available science and approaches, for example, the grouping approach. And the second level is the identification and prevention of issues of concern from further expanding and causing more negative impacts through horizon scanning and early warning. If I may be allowed to elaborate a little bit on those 2 points. So for the second one about identification and prevention early, UNEP recently published a global foresight report on planetary health and human well-being. It concluded that adopting a forward-looking and precautionary approach is essential in identifying emerging risks, shaping more effective and preventative decisions for a better future. And in this report, unseen risks of harmful chemicals has both high impacts and high likelihoods. So the horizon scanning function of the SPP will be one of the key mechanisms to delve into more details to identify new emerging IOC and provide suggestions on preventative interventions needed. And all relevant regulations are encouraged to work with SPP and work with each other to collectively prevent, reduce, and mitigate these IOCs. And my last elaboration is the first point about designing out from the very beginning. So in the area of chemicals, we have internationally established criteria for hazardous chemicals, or criteria gaining more consensus, like PBT, PMT, CMR, EDC. However, a shortcoming of the implementation is that they are normally like reactionary, that substances are regulated only long after the first awareness of red flags. So how to incorporate this scientifically solid toxicity criteria into regulations, not only in chemical regulations, but in a holistic way that they collectively could send a strong signal and obligation to the private sector and innovators to design out chemicals with these toxic properties is one priority thing. So again, to break the silos. So in short, if we want to shift from reactive to more proactive and preventative, I would say design out by holistic policy design plus identification and prevention early, which is highly depends on transparency. And I would stop here, and I'm happy to take further questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melissa, for those comments, which again stimulate a lot of thought. Please do use the question and answer box to pose any questions that we can take forward in the discussion section. Thank you. Now, our third speaker in this first panel is Frankie Arono. He's based in Texas, and he's the executive director of the Society of Native Nations. So he is a very strong voice for Indigenous people, arguing for environmental justice and human rights. And he's also involved in the UN stakeholder group on Indigenous rights, the major group on Indigenous rights in UNEP negotiations. So Frankie, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. From my side, good morning. Bear with me, I'm still having a few more cups of coffee because of the lack of sleep I've had in the last couple of days, like I'm sure many of you are also working with and dealing with. So First, I want to say thank you to UNEP for these efforts and these analyses. So my first overview of the summary analysis from my perspective is that the report looks to highlight the urgent need for international action to address the risks posed by hazardous chemicals and waste, emphasizing the importance on holistic approaches, transparency, and inclusivity. It underscores the disproportionate impacts of chemical pollution on vulnerable populations, which needs to not often include, but instead always include indigenous communities due to their close relationship with the environment and reliance on the relationship with all creation that has been labeled as natural resources. I've also seen, the document emphasize on the importance of centering indigenous peoples and indigenous knowledge and future work. This is why we, the Indigenous Peoples Major Group, requested that an Indigenous Advisory Committee, IAC, be established within the SPP. This recognition can lead to more effective and culturally appropriate solutions for managing chemicals and waste, and or eliminating banning in indigenous territories. The focus on protecting vulnerable populations is crucial for indigenous communities who are disproportionately affected by the environmental contamination due to factors like proximity to industrial sites, infrastructure, with our traditional food sources, and limited access to healthcare. Someone mentioned earlier about the holistic approaches. We also have noticed the call for holistic solutions align and agree that it aligns with indigenous worldviews, indigenous knowledge, which emphasizes the interconnectedness of all living things, all creation, and the need for sustainable, non-toxic practices that protect human health and the environment for all future generations. We agree that improved awareness and education about the risk of the hazardous chemicals are essential for indigenous communities who are exposed to these substances through traditional practices or contaminated food and water sources. Some of the things that I have seen or feel that has been lacking a little bit on some of what my analysis is that while the document does mention the importance of centering indigenous peoples, it lacks specific details on how this will be done in practice. More concrete strategies are needed to ensure meaningful participation of indigenous communities in decision-making processes related to chemicals and waste management, such as, again, the proposed Indigenous Advisory Committee that we proposed during the open-ended working group 3. Despite recommendations and indigenous voices, they're still marginalized in policymaking processes, limiting their influence on international actions that directly affect our communities. The document doesn't explicitly address the potential impacts of chemical pollution on traditional practices such as hunting, fishing, gathering medicinal plants. So there needs to be more research, guidance from indigenous knowledge holders, and attention, the attentions are needed to that attention needs to be understood and to help mitigate these risks. Also being seen as indigenous knowledge as indigenous science, equally, and as science that's founded and used in these spaces. Indigenous communities, particularly those in lower income regions, lack the financial and technical resources needed to implement recommended safety measures, increasing their vulnerability to chemical pollution, which needs to be highlighted and spoken more about moving forward. The influence on commercial and industrial interests overshadow the rights of indigenous peoples and the environmental protections, particularly in contexts where profit driven decisions are prioritized over ecological and human health. So I would say overall, the document provides a valuable framework for addressing the issues of chemical pollution, but feel it needs to be further developed, as I'm sure many feel the same way, to ensure that the specific needs and concerns of Indigenous peoples and environmental justice communities, frontline, fence line communities are fully considered and addressed at all stages and levels of the decision-making processes in these spaces. So again, I appreciate the conversation. I appreciate that we are hearing and listening to each other and working towards developing safeguards for human health and environment when it comes to the impacts of chemical pollution. And yeah, I look forward to continuing these discussions and ensuring that the voices that come from the disproportionately impacted communities are seen as experts. They know what has worked and what hasn't worked for generations. Indigenous knowledge is science. It's founded science, and it needs to be seen as expert advice. That's what I would say in any way. So thank you. Haku.
Thank you very much, Frankie, for that contribution, which gives us, again, another very important perspective. We have 2 or 3 minutes before we move on to the second panel. So I'd just like to pick up some of the comments that have been made in the question session. I think some of them are comments, perhaps more than questions, but just to return to a theme that Bob introduced and Melissa developed a bit. Bob was talking about the need to keep knowledge and innovation in step and to do rather better at learning the problems at the same time as we as we innovate, so that we can get the appropriate controls in place. And some countries have attempted to do that in Europe with the REACH approach, for example, to get the data as things are placed on the market. But what can we do to improve that? Is the Science Policy Panel going to be an important way forward? Do you think it will capture some of the Indigenous knowledge that Frankie was talking about? Do you have high hopes for this panel, Melissa, in addressing the sort of issues covered in this report? Do you have a comment, Melissa?
That's a very big question about hope, right? So I would like to, given that we have only 2 or 3 minutes, I would like to quote somebody that speak at a conference I was attending last week. She said, "I'm a pessimist in theory, but an optimist in practice." I think that captures a lot of our mood, despite there's a lot of frustrations we see with the progress under a lot of regimes and implementations. But I believe, and hearing all those colleagues who have been collectively providing not only the frustration about what is lacking, but also some of the constructive actions we can take forward, I think we must hold up hope and continue to deliver hope through solid and constructive actions at all levels. And I would like to take chance also to cover on the SPP. I think that depends on what kind of final mandate the SPP receives from the outcome of the negotiation. And I really have a lot of hope for the SPP could take on broader mandate to work on a lot of issues we have been talking today. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. And Frankie, you'll see in the question, there's one I think aimed at you, asking, or in your area, asking if there's a reporting system for Indigenous communities to report ecological impacts of pollution. So I don't know if you have a response to that, and how you see the SPP also trying to capture the Indigenous knowledge and feed it into the policy making decisions on regulation at the key stages. Frankie.
Yeah, thank you for that question, and it's very complex, really, as we continue to struggle and fight for more participation and inclusivity in the decision-making processes, right? And I remember when in Geneva attending one of the chemicals framework conferences, and some of the solutions, again, and we've seen over and over again, is about data collection. We need more data. We need to create a database. We need to make it public and, make it accessible. And, my response is that there is enough data. If you look into the human health issues we've had in our communities for generations, go to the hospitals, get the data, see the increased exposure and rates on cancer and chronic lung disease and organ failure, and those needing a Albuterol just to be able to breathe freely in the very homes and communities that you've lived for generations. There's plenty of data to see. And I would say this as well, is that most in our community, they're not gonna, that are struggling with these issues, that have 2, 3 jobs, that have to take their parents or their children or loved ones, on a bus or pushed in a wheelchair down the sidewalk, to get to the hospital for their appointments for chemo or radiation or whatever it may be that they're facing, don't have the time to say, you know what, I'm gonna go to the grocery store, I'm gonna go to the supermarket, but before I go, let me look up this database and see what kind of toxins are in the products that are being sold, that I'm gonna go and purchase for my family and bring into my homes. They don't have that time, first of all, and second of all, they're not going to understand a lot of the terminology that's being presented in these. There is no real system to really be inclusive of our communities, truly, and I think that's something that we lack to view, and we need to work harder on addressing and providing this kind of context in the way that our communities will truly understand. And, I think that many of our elders would say, human beings overcomplicate things sometimes. And, we need to simplify again and say, look, if you poison your water, you're probably going to die. You poison your food, you're going to either get really, really sick or die. We need just to stop. They'll tell you, just stop uh, putting things out of balance, and be reminded of our responsibilities of that we bring, and that are responsible for to keeping things in balance if you want a healthy, sustainable future for all future generations, right? That we're not separate from our environment, and these things that we produce, these chemicals threaten that well-being of future generations. So it needs to be discussed more, but also at the same time, we need to realize that the sense of the urgency that is needed to deal with these issues like now. Because as we speak now on this webinar, as we gather at these conferences, and talk about text and language and preambles and so forth, there's our people are dying in our communities in exponential rates than ever. And so that's the urgency, and that's why there needs to be inclusivity, and participation at all stages and levels of these discussions. So that would be kind of my answer. I hope I answered it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frankie, for giving us that really clear reminder of the importance of the issues that we're dealing with and the urgency of dealing with them. Perhaps just in a final question, I can come back to you, Bob, who you stress the fact that a lot of countries still lack the capacity to implement regulations around these areas. That's something we've been talking about for many, many years. In the questions, there was a reminder that the Forum on Chemical Safety was dealing with that 15 years ago. We've had the SciChem Quick Start program. We've had various initiatives. Why are we not making better progress in getting the systems in place that we need to address these issues?
Well, thanks for the question. There's probably a multitude of reasons. There's one area where I think we have made quite a bit of progress, and that is with the implementation of the globally harmonized system for classification and labeling, which I think is now implemented by about 100 countries. So that's quite remarkable, and it really sets the beyond informing professionals and in some countries consumers, it really sets the basis for developing a more complex chemicals management system. And that is happening now. We see that, certainly at the OECD, we see that some countries, when they are starting to develop their chemicals management system, are trying to make best use of what the GHS already does and building upon it, because it reduces costs, it helps you do your priority setting, it helps you make your risk management system more efficient. So that's the positive aspects, I would say. On the negative aspect, yes, indeed, I think we, as of today, we have not yet found efficient chemicals management systems that are also cheap to run and implement. It does cost something to your national budget to efficiently run a good chemicals management system. So, and that is where the big hurdle is for convincing. There's two big hurdles: convincing that it is worthwhile to set up the chemicals management system in the first place, and convincing your Ministry of Budget to make sure that you have long-term funding to run it. So those are the two big hurdles. So one of the answers is it is worthwhile investing in studies of costs of inaction, and that's coming back to a question you asked earlier. That's also one of the areas where I hope the SPP will help us out. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bob, and thank you to the three contributors to that first panel. Thank you for your contributions, and please do continue to pose questions which we can note, and everyone, you're welcome to answer the questions in writing as well if you wish as we continue. Well, we've had several references to the importance of the global framework on chemicals, which is seen as by many stakeholders as being really key to addressing many of the issues covered in this report. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Kay Williams, who's going to introduce the next panel discussion, looking at how we tackle the issues and the way forward. Kay and I worked together for many years in the UK Environment Department, but Kay earlier this year took on the role as the head of the Secretariat of the Global Framework on Chemicals, so she is very well placed to address the issues covered in the report. Kay, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, John, and delighted to be here. Interesting to note that the Global Framework on Chemicals indeed has been seen as a vehicle for trying to take forward a number of these issues of concern. And I would say that we mustn't lose sight of the fact that this new agreement, agreed a year ago in Bonn, is a very key multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral framework through which we can deliver change, and we must deliver change. The focus of the framework is very much on implementation. And there are a number of mechanisms and vehicles through which implementation can happen, be they through alliances, be they through what's known as implementation programs. And the Secretariat here has been working very closely with the IMC organizations to try and develop what an implementation programs would look like in terms of their mandates, their terms of reference, so that we can really bring that coherence and holistic approach that everyone is talking about together in the activities that we do as stakeholders in this area. So in terms of what if the framework can do, if we look at some of the issues that were grouped together in terms of metals, metalloids, I mean, there is existing work going, and we need to be aware of that existing work. We need to be promoting that existing work, and we need to be interfacing with it. So we know that there is a global alliance on lead in paint, but it's gone further than that, and the USA have been working very closely with others, including Germany, to try and make that a broader type of discussion to include lead more generally. And we know that certainly the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution has also been working very much on lead and identifying and raising the profile, and there have been various reports that have identified the significant impact that lead estimates of lead poisoning are having on the economic ability of countries. So I think the Global Framework on Chemicals stands ready to provide that stage to be able to bring actors together on existing initiatives, and that's what we've got to work with, I think, of how to do that. In terms of the implementation programs that the framework is working on together with the that's being led by the IMC organizations, the legislative issue and the legislative approach is absolutely key. And I think Bob has articulated some of the issues that we're facing, but that is absolutely a top priority. We now are focusing on implementation. We need to understand the barriers, but also we need to be trying to future-proof the work that we do. We know that the regulatory arena in terms of legislation is changing. And we know that it's really important that we need to have strong regulation in the area of chemicals and wastes. But how we do it, I think, will be impacted by new initiatives and new technologies that are coming forward. And I think it's our responsibility to at least be aware of those things, to make sure that, in fact, the skills for the future are the ones that are needed. We know that we've been hugely reliant on ecotoxicologists and chemical specialists. I think in the future, we need to possibly have more awareness of informaticians, looking at people who understand data. How do we harness the artificial intelligence that is out there that potentially could really help us analyze the risks and manage the risks and assess them in the way that we need to be able to safely address chemicals management. Secondly, some of the implementation work has been looking at economic and industry sectors. And I think that a number of the issues of concern that have been raised, especially chemicals in products, 95% of the products we have will consist of chemicals. It could easily come through and integrate in some of the sectors, the high impact sectors that are being currently looked at, and that hopefully we can take forward, especially to the open-ended working group that will be happening in June next year. And then thirdly, integration with the decision making and being aware of some of the interlinkages with other conventions, climate change, and biodiversity, and others, including the development agenda, including finance. We must try and integrate that decision-making and making us aware of where we got the co-benefits, tapping into some of those resources where we share common ways, not common outcomes. In terms of the Science Policy Panel, absolutely, I think that's an important if it gets to be agreed, the Science Policy will be an important forum for the Global Framework on Chemicals. It will provide that evidence-based and policy-relevant recommendations, both for the emerging issues of concern, but also for current ones, to help the community really focus its actions in a holistic way. I think we need to be looking at how we other approaches on how we transform the industry to make sure that they're acting now, that the onus is on them to be making that difference. So we're keen to talk to investors of some of those big organizations, talking about sustainability disclosures. How do we inject and make sure that chemicals are part of those reporting standards that are being currently looked at and harmonized in all levels and are very important in the environmental issues that we face today. I certainly believe that the youth is very important. I was at a recent conference where youth entrepreneurs from the African region were really doing some excellent stuff, I think particularly on carbon, but I think we can look to youth to say, youth, how can you help us transform processes that are happening, and that we engage then with the development banks and some of those investors and institutions so that they can invest in some of the solutions that the youth are bringing forward in this 21st century. And I'm delighted to hear actually the voice of Frankie today, because I think Indigenous communities is one that does get forgotten, and I think we really need to bring the voice of that through the various initiatives, the implementation programs, the alliances, and whether we need to put a spotlight on that. I think I certainly will be reaching out to the Secretariat to make sure that we can integrate that voice moving forward. So there are different routes, I think, for the global framework to interact. We do have alliances. We've got the Food and Agriculture Organization that's leading on the Global Alliance of Highly Hazardous Pesticides. They've been doing some work on governance and trying to set up this alliance, and I think we should be seeing something from them very shortly. And I know that the World Health Organization has been doing some work looking at pharmaceuticals, which are really, really a very significant industry in terms of their impact on not only humans, but the environment and their sustainability. And I know that they're really keen to set up and look along the value chain to see what can be done to bring the actors together to have a really strong potential implementation program in that regard. And so with that, I'd like to just then pass back to John.
Thank you very much, Kay. It's very helpful to hear about the progress that you're making in getting the global framework underway, and clearly a very important part of the architecture for finding solutions. Thank you. Our next speaker is Marjolein Boe, who comes from the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions, and therefore can bring us the experience of the legally binding approaches that have been very successful in their mandates in tackling the chemicals and the waste issues that they cover. So Marjolein, we'd welcome your reactions to the report and a view on the contribution which BRS or bodies, conventions like BRS can make in tackling these issues. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, John, for this question, which I think will bring some also important aspect to the discussion today. First of all, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to UNEP for inviting us in this important launch and panel discussion on chemicals and waste issues of concern, and also I wish to thank the GEN for organizing this event. So the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions welcome the summary analysis of stakeholders' view as a significant contribution to advancing global awareness on the 19 issues of concern. So it's an important element. And the second, of course, is also to serve as a catalyst for continuing the dialogue on potential international actions on those. The Secretariat was pleased to take part in the consultations throughout the process, contributing insights on how the BRS conventions address these issues. So we see that the summary analysis rightly acknowledges that several factors or options must be considered in determining the next steps of the report. In particular, whether we should build on existing mechanisms and instruments or establish new ones. The summary also notes strong links with other global agendas and an important role for and the need to coordinate with international forums such as the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions. Indeed, the scope of the BRS conventions overlaps with several of the 19 issues of concern, such as the life cycle approach to electronic and electrical products, HSLIP, but also PFAS, chemicals in products, highly hazardous pesticides, endocrine disrupting chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and nanomaterials. So quick wins can therefore be achieved under the conventions when considering future international actions. And here, allow me to give a few examples to illustrate my saying. So over the last 2 decades, parties to the Basel Convention have strengthened their efforts to address electrical and electronic waste. They have developed technical guidelines and tools. They have established multi-stakeholder partnerships to reduce the generation of e-waste, control their transborder movements, and also enhance their environmentally sound management. In 2023, the parties to the Basel Convention also extended the scope of the Basel Convention to include all e-wastes under the Convention's obligations. So this new requirement, which will become effective on the 1st of January 2025, marks a significant step in strengthening global e-waste management. Therefore, international actions on H-slip can benefit from this amendment by aligning effort and supporting its implementation. So here we can see indeed cross benefits of action between different forums. Now, if we turn to, for example, PFAS, the Stockholm Convention has played a crucial role in the international phase-out of long-chain PFAS. And currently, substances such as PFOS, PFOA, and PFHXS are listed under the Convention for elimination or restriction. And the next conferences of the parties to the Stockholm Convention will also consider another group of PFAS for listing. Therefore, it's also providing an avenue for possible international actions on PFAS. On the issue of global concern regarding chemicals in products, it's also a topic that is very dear to the heart of the conventions. For example, the Stockholm Convention is currently looking at further options through the work of the POPs Review Committee, including innovative ways that can assist parties to the convention to identify POPs in stockpiles, but also in products and articles in use and in waste. So this work, which will be presented at the next conference of the parties, is quite innovative and interesting, also for the issue of concerns on chemicals in products. So here as well, there is potential to collaborate across forums and strengthen the implementation of existing instruments as a possible way forward. But other opportunities exist, for example, on issues of concerns related to HHPs, EDC, nanomaterial waste, pharmaceutical waste, and metals containing waste. So looking ahead, the next meetings of the governing bodies of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions will take place next year in Geneva from the 28th of April to the 9th of May. And so at these meetings, parties to the conventions will have an opportunity to continue to strengthen international actions on some of the issues of global concern, but also to explore linkages with other relevant forums, such as the International Conference on the Global Framework on Chemicals, where maybe further specific actions on issues of global concerns may be decided. So the next meetings of the COPs could also be a milestone in the global international efforts to tackle issues of concern. In conclusion, so addressing the issue of concerns will require our collective commitment and coordinated actions in a holistic manner, as it was highlighted by previous speakers, as well as in the report. So let's seize every opportunity across forums to identify the necessary solution. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mylene, for that contribution and highlighting the extensive work that's already underway in the BRS conventions to tackle many of these issues. Our final speaker in this session is Delia Marquez. Delia is a Venezuelan lawyer and academic who is an expert in human rights. She's with us today in her role as a spokesperson for the major group on women in the UN negotiations, UNEP negotiations. So we look forward to hearing your perspective. The floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here, speaking on behalf of the Women's Major Group. And also, I want to congratulate UNEP for this great report and all the staff working on this. In this sense, the challenges surrounding chemical and waste are deeply connected to broader environmental, social, intergenerational, and gender justice issues. As we look for future actions, it is crucial to prioritize inclusive and holistic solutions that recognize the intersection of these challenges. In that sense, about tackling issues of concern and the way forward, I would like to highlight, first of all, we must shift away from addressing chemicals one at a time. This means that this approach has its limitations, especially given the cumulative impacts on health and the ecosystems. Therefore, the Women's Major Group advocates for a grouping approach in regulation, tackling families of chemicals together. This will ensure that vulnerable communities are protected, particularly the marginalized, including women, of course, children and youth, and indigenous communities, often bear the burden of these environmental harms. The push for grouping chemicals in this of the traditional substance by substance method aligns with the Women's Major Group advocacy for a comprehensive approach that integrates health, biodiversity, and human rights, including also the precautionary principle and the polluter pays principle. Second one, it is key to go for a proactive approach, to switch from reactive to preventive policies. We must prioritize a gender-responsive, intergenerational capacity building, and of course, collaboration efforts between the science and policy panel, governments, and civil society are essential. These efforts should focus on sound chemicals management and pollution prevention with an emphasis on gender-responsive to ensure equitable resources and leadership opportunities for women and all groups in vulnerable situations. Third, it is fundamental to enhancing transparency and access to information. As you may know, women are disproportionately affected by the lack of transparency in the life cycle of chemicals. Therefore, the right to know policies and the use of the digital platforms tracking chemicals are crucial to empower the communities and foster accountability. Moreover, the collection of gender disaggregated data and the promotion of a gender-sensitive research are vital for ensuring that women's experiences inform policies and, of course, the scientific recommendations. Enhancing transparency through better labeling and gender disaggregated data is crucial for empowerment of the communities, particularly those groups in vulnerable situations or the marginalized communities, to make informed decisions and influence the policies. So, what needs to be done next? We must enforce the current regulations that we already have, develop new international binding instruments, and ensure that the cross-sectoral collaboration includes marginalized voices, particularly youths, women's, and indigenous communities. Monitoring mechanisms should be put in place to track the integration of a gender perspective in the work of the Science and Policy Panel. Finally, the international collaboration is a fundamental aspect. Collaboration with existing frameworks, such as the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm and Minamata Conventions, along with the new Science and Policy Panel, should be focused on incorporating the voices of the groups in most vulnerable situations, like the children and youth, women's major group, indigenous communities, in decision-making, ensuring their equitable participation in the negotiations and the solutions. From our perspective, the role of the Science and Policy Panel must promote gender disaggregated data, gender-sensitive research to ensure more inclusive and just policies that reflect the different impacts of chemicals in women, especially in other marginalized communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Delia, for that perspective. It's very helpful to have that. And I think what's clearly emerging through our discussion is the importance of different groups being engaged and being able to have a say and an influence on the way in which these policies developed. And we've heard that in relation to the SPP, we've heard it in relation to marginalised groups, Indigenous groups, to women and to youth as well. And that's a real challenge for those who are seeking to construct and organise these new treaties, the new SPP, and to organise the implementation of the new global framework. Some interesting comments have come up in the chat. I see some comments from, I think, Dr. Dada in Nigeria about having a holistic approach and finding a way forward. And he's suggesting a treaty on groups of chemicals. There was also a question about whether we need some more overarching convention on chemicals in waste, which has oversight to ensure that the issues of concern are not lost in the current siloed approach. I wonder, Kay, I mean, do you have a reaction to that? Is the global framework able to provide any leadership across the whole field, or does that really fall to IOMC to deliver? Do you have a reaction, Kay?
Yeah, interesting to see that. I mean, the global framework on chemicals is voluntary, but that's partly because we're multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral, and that's the strength of the framework, because we do need all the actors at the table. From my point of view, a personal point of view, is that yes, there are lots of activities happening, but the framework really is a very good place where we can try and bring those actors together, give them a voice, and also give a platform to those activities where the knowledge can be shared, and also bring new relevant actors in, especially down the value chain. I do wonder whether the time for negotiating and talking about new conventions has come, and really the framework is enough to be able to take the actions that we require now, because as we all know, negotiating a new legally binding framework costs a huge amount of money and often takes many years. So I think we're ready to implement, and we need to be implementing urgently. So we welcome the cooperation and collaboration of all actors so that we can take that big step forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, from your perspective, Delia, you seek to engage with all these bodies. We have legally binding conventions, which is great because they can operate on an effective of having legal principles behind them and binding obligations, whereas the other initiatives are voluntary. How do you see the architecture we have as a group who is trying to speak with a particular perspective and bring a lot of information to the negotiating table?
Sorry, I cannot hear the last few words.
I was just saying that you're speaking for a major group. You're trying to bring influence to the table. How do you see the architecture? Do you see it as being effective, or is it a challenge for you to operate in?
Okay, yeah. It's a really good question. Thank you so much for that question. So it is a challenge to us as major groups, because yes, there is a structure to include our voices into the different decision-making spaces, but usually it is hard to get the opportunity to get the floor during the negotiations.
Yeah.
In any case, we took the opportunity to be there to participate and influence directly to the decision makers. But it will be good if we can ensure, by example, in the Science and Policy panel, the participation of those that are facing the consequences of the pollution because of the chemicals and waste. Because yes, we know that this will be a panel with a lot of people coming from the scientific sector, but youth, indigenous communities, and women, we are also including in that sector. So we are researchers, we have the knowledge, but also we face the experience. So it would be great if we this mechanism in which one some members or participants during this negotiation saw the major groups only as environmental activists. And we can start to see us as experts, as people focus on science, but putting the transsectional gender perspective, youth perspective, and indigenous people perspective into our research. So it would be good if we can shift this view that we have about the major groups. We also are experts, and we have like additional background. We face the consequences.
Yeah.
So that would be great. Thank you.
And I wonder, Marlene, if you have a perspective. I mean, you work within a legally binding framework, which gives you enormous power and an opportunity to have a direct influence, because you can introduce global controls if the parties agree and are prepared to support them. But the downside is you have to work within your mandate and you can't stray beyond the mandate. And because you're exercising legally binding powers, the countries keep quite tight control, I guess, on what you're doing. Are you able to engage with the wider sources of knowledge and bring civil society to the table in your negotiations? Do you have a reaction or not? Is that an unfair question to ask you?
No, thank you for the very interesting question. First of all, a point that I would like to make also, and you know it very well, is the evolving nature of the conventions. So they are not also stuck, they are able to evolve over time through the efforts by the parties. So we have amendments, we have new things happening, the expansion of the scope, the remit of the conventions happen. So they are dynamic instruments. Of course, we parties work under the scope and the obligations of the conventions, and we are limited by this mandate. However, we have also a huge, liberty under international cooperation, I must say. So the conventions are very keen. I mean, parties to the conventions are very keen to ensure that the conventions are mutually supportive to other instruments in the chemicals and waste cluster, first of all. So we have very close collaboration with Minamata Convention and with SAICM, the new SAICM, the Global Framework on Chemicals. So it is extremely important for our parties that we are seen as a contribution also to other processes and also to the broader environmental agenda, climate change, biodiversity. So just to put that in the picture as well, that normally, I mean, BRS parties like to also cooperate with others, and we would be welcome to also welcoming cooperation on the way forward for the issues of global concern. The voices of all the stakeholders are extremely important, of course, for the BRS conventions. We have a huge amount of observers to meetings of the conferences of the parties and to all our subsidiary bodies. Especially in recent years, we've seen really a huge increase in the number of observers. So groups representing women or indigenous people. So it's a very rich indeed to be able to hear different views, perspective on issues, especially for what was mentioned before. They are often the most impacted groups. So we need to hear from them also because they are experts. They have the knowledge to understand the issues, but also to find solutions. So I would really encourage groups to come forward to the meetings of the COPs in April, and also to put forward, proposals for how to better integrate their knowledge and their knowledge about solutions in the processes of the conventions in moving forward. Thanks a lot for the very interesting question.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're drawing to the end of the time we have available. So thank you to everyone who's contributed to the discussion. We do have the chat and we do have the other questions, which people will bear in mind as this work goes forward. But I'd like to give the floor to Ludovic from UNEP to respond to some of the themes and talk about the future. So Ludovic, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John, and thank you to all the people that participated in this event today, including the panelists, of course. So we've heard a few key points that I'd like to put forward, and then that will help us move forward on these issues. We've heard many times that we need to break down silos, have holistic approach, and address the issues by grouping them. So that's an important point, and I think that we have started this in this report, but we need to go further. We need to work with existing and forthcoming instruments to make sure that the issues are covered and mentioned in the various instruments. That concerns, of course, the chemicals instruments, but not only. We need, of course, to consider synergies between the triple planetary crisis and work with climate change instruments and biodiversity instruments as well. We've heard also many times by many panelists that we should leave no one behind. We need to focus and make sure that indigenous people, women, people at risk of the exposure of chemicals are really participating in this discussion, that they are equipped with the knowledge and the capacity to participate in this discussion, and their voice are heard. Of course, we've heard also that we need innovative policy and legal tools to be able to manage chemicals effectively. And as for the holistic approach, this might not mean tools that manage chemicals by chemicals, but rather groupings or as we also try to work in UNEP in sectors to address value chains as a whole. But for this to work, we need strong science. We need science to inform policy. And for that, we need collaboration among countries, because the capacity is not the same everywhere. However, the needs are the same. So we need strong science to inform policy, as was highlighted by our executive director at the ICCM5 last year in front of the private sector. The private sector are the innovators. They are the ones that will find solutions to the current problems, but they need to be strongly linked to this legal framework, and so that we avoid the creation of new issues as much as possible, and the new ones that are created are dealt with as efficiently as possible immediately. I would like also to reflect on the global framework on chemicals. Kay Williams told us this is a voluntary framework, and this is true, it's voluntary, but as Kay mentioned, this is also a strength. This is where we have civil society, we have the private sector, and we have governments, international organizations together trying to work for solutions. So these are important mechanisms for us to look forward to. The implementation of the framework will help us with managing these issues better in the future, moving away from chemical by chemical issues and working more holistically all together. So I will stop here and the floor back to you, John, I think, to close about the event officially. But again, I would like to really thank all the people that have participated in this process and were on the call today. We have noted the comments. We will also we will work on this as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ludovic, for those comments. And I'd just like to add my thanks to all the panelists and to everyone who's contributed comments or questions, and they can all be noted. So I think that brings us to towards the end of our session, and I'd like to hand over to Diana from the Environmental Network to talk about some future events. Diana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much to you also, John, for your excellent moderation and for guiding us through this event. And we at the Geneva Environment Network also extend our thanks to the panelists, but also to all the attendees who were with us on a Friday afternoon. I would like to mention here, make some publicity for some upcoming events. that can be of interest for this community. You have heard two important mechanisms being negotiated, the plastics, the Future Plastics Treaty and the Science Policy Panel. We have a few events coming up in the coming weeks in preparation to those two negotiations. You have here some announcements. You see here some photos and dates for these events. So we look forward very much to see you also at these events. Wishing you a great afternoon, a great day for those for whom it's still the morning, a good night for who is already night, and saying now goodbye to you all. Thank you very much.